So good to be here. I was gone the last two Sundays, so my first time in this new venue, and so good to see so many of you. We were we went to a family reunion in the United States. Met with my siblings over the 4th of July weekend. Yeah, one Saturday that we met all the family, we were around 50 people. Only one brother here from Brazil couldn't make it. My wife Jenny is still there. She stayed to attend a wedding of a nephew next Saturday, so she'll be only back next week. But as Eduardo usually says, it's good to travel, but it's very good to be back. Our passage for this morning is the text that we read in Colossians. Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. I'm going to focus on 15 through 23. And the passage that was just read, and we don't need to read it again, but I will be referring to a few verses. I've come across a while ago through social media with this activist against anti-Semitism by the name of Rawan Osman. She is from a Syrian Lebanese background. Her parents were secular Muslims, one from a Sunni tradition, other from a Shia tradition. I mean, completely different tradition in the Muslim faith. But she grew up as a secular Muslim in Lebanon, and of course taught that Jews were their enemies. And she met for the first time a Jewish or Jew people in her mid-20s when she moved to France. And she had a panic attack. Well, eventually she converted to Judaism. And today she's an activist against anti-Semitism. But in her story, one thing caught my attention. You know, why she came from, Arab, Islam background, and she became a Jew, not only Jew, but a Orthodox Jew. And someone who was basically atheist before, although she was in a Muslim tradition. And she decided to study Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and that took her to different countries and so forth. But what she says is that reading the Jewish scripture, which is our Old Testament, called also the Tanakh by the Jews, she noticed, what she says, that there is a certain realism about the Jewish prophets. So she refers to Moses and other prophets. What she means by that is that in the Old Testament, when the main leaders, like Moses and David and Abraham, the main leaders of the Jewish tradition, or we could say the heroes of the stories in the Old Testament, they're not Superman. You read about their weaknesses, their insecurities, their doubts, and so on. So that's what she means by realism. And she compares this or contrasts this to Islam and Christianity. According to her, you don't see that in Islam and Christianity. For her, in Islam, both Islam and Christianity, the prophet, the main prophet, comes from heaven. Well, when I came across this text, it reminded me this story, and the question I asked myself is, um, does this really show that there's not certain realism? Well, it's good to remember that the Old Testament is part of our Christian scripture also, and yes, indeed, we see that many heroes in the Old Testament are people that have their weaknesses and insecurity and so on. It is true that the New Testament, and especially Paul, when it speaks of Jesus, it speaks of Jesus not as a prophet only, but as one that is same with God. And you may say that this text that we read may encourage this thinking of this activist, but on a closer look, we see that Paul describes Jesus not only as this person who is the image of the true God, the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, but he's also the one that took our weaknesses. Part of this text that we read, Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, may have been a hymn. It's considered as a hymn. In our printed Bible, it's not printed in a poetical form. But some versions of the Bible today, it's printed in the form of a hymn. It's believed that it's a hymn. It's a hymn about Jesus, about this one who is the image of the invisible God. The hymn about Christ and the new relationship with the Gentiles. And this is part of the introductory part of the letter of Paul to the Colossians. It's actually very typical of his type of writing. He writes, and he usually has some prayer in the beginning or some statement about God, about Christ. And the focus is on the blessing of having been rescued from the power of darkness, and that includes the Gentiles. So I'm going to read two verses that weren't read, verses 12 and 13. It says, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the dominion of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. So this is an important statement about what Jesus has done. And of course, Paul is writing to the Christians in Colossae, which was mainly Gentiles, non-Jews. So it's a very good news to know that Christ came not only to the Jewish nation, to Jews, but also to the Gentiles. This is the focus of Paul. So it speaks of Jesus as the center of creation and of his role and action in recreating everything. The new condition that includes the Gentiles. It's interesting that Paul many times will point to Jesus. I mean, whatever he speaks of, as far as the community, as far as their beliefs, as far as our morals, has to do with Jesus. It doesn't have to do only with moral values or behavior or so on. It has to do with who Jesus is and what he does. So I want to focus and divide these verses that we read in two parts and focus the two main things that Paul refers to. And the first section is verses 15 through 20. And his focus is on Jesus. And he's basically saying who Jesus is and a little bit of what he's done. But I want to call your attention to the repetition of the expression all things. So from verses 15 through 20, we see this, I think, at least 9 times. So he's the image of the invisible God, firstborn of all creation. For him, all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones, dominion, principalities, and authority. All things were created through him and for him. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. He's the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For him, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And then finally, verse 20, through him to reconcile him all things. Focus is that there's nothing that is not under God, Jesus' dominion. He is above all things, and all things exist because of him and for him and through him. At least 3 times it's mentioned the expression firstborn. He is the first of all things, and so on. And the focus, as I said, is in what Jesus is, who Jesus is. It says he's the image of the invisible God. This may refer not only to his divinity, it refers also to his humanity in a sense that human beings were created in the image of God. The difference is that our human nature got corrupted because of human sin. But Jesus is this perfect image of God, as God had intended. So he's firstborn of creation, and everything exists in him, through him, and for him. And in him all things hold together. Interestingly, though, it says that he is the firstborn of those who died. Where's the verse? I missed the verse here. Verse 18. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. You may wonder, well, if he is similar to God, image of the invisible God, he is, in him everything was created. How does he die? Well, in a sense, there's some realism here. Jesus came as a human being, and he died. And he died that he may be the first one of human to take the power over death. This reminds me of the text in Isaiah 57, verse 15, that says about God, and it says like this, thus says the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, and also with those who are contrite and humble in spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble, and to revive the heart of the contrite. This is a contrast. It speaks of the Old Testament, but it also, in this passage of Paul in Colossians, it also portrayed Jesus as that. God is the one that lives on high, the lofty one. He inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. You may think it's a God that is beyond our reach. It's beyond everything. It's not one of us. He's out there at the same time. It says, I dwell in the high and holy place, and also with those who are contrite and humble in spirit. I see there is a realism here. God is God, eternal. He lives on high, but He is with us. He's in our heart. This passage in Colossians portrays Jesus just as that. The one who is the firstborn of all creation. He was there in the beginning. In Him all things exist. Through Him and for Him all things exist. You may think, somebody completely unreachable. You can't get close to this person. He's completely unreachable. No, He is the head of the church, and He is with His people, and He came to save us. This idea reminds us also as how John, Apostle John, describes Jesus in the first chapter of his gospel. He's the Logos, He's the Word. He was in the beginning with God, but He came and inhabited among us. Everything exists because of Him, for Him, in Him, but He also comes as a human being, and He is present and accessible to those who want to follow Him. Well, verses 18, second part of verse 18, and until verse 20, in a sense, speaks of the purpose. Up to verse 15, it speaks of who Jesus is. There are several times the verb is used, at least in the Greek, and basically the main statements here in verse 15, it speaks of who Jesus is, not so much of what He does, what He did, but what He is. But when we come to verse 18, and second part of verse 18, it starts speaking of why He is that, or for what purpose. For what purpose? Note that the expression in verse 18, that in everything He might be preeminent. Can be translated as so that. It expresses a purpose, so that in everything He might be preeminent. For in Him all fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Verse 19 basically states the reason for that. And verse 20 will speak of Him making peace by the blood of His cross. When I come to this statement in verse 18, that in everything He might be preeminent, you may think, well, didn't Paul just say that He is the firstborn of all creation? In Him everything exists. Why would He use an expression that in everything He might be preeminent? For the purpose so that He might be preeminent. Well, what I see here is Paul is probably making a distinction here. one thing is the objective truth of who Jesus is. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. In him all things were created. Whether you believe it or not, whether people believe it or not, that's who he is. He is. Not everybody's accept that. Not everybody believes that. But when it comes to the second part of verse 18, it seems as Paul is referring or using an expression that is more subjective. What does that mean? Well, Jesus is this, which I just described. Not many people are going to accept or believe that. But he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that, I'll paraphrase here, so that he may be recognized, so that people may recognize him as first, as preeminent in all things, because in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. As we read the Gospels, we see that not many people accept Jesus' message. So is today. Not many people accept Jesus' message. For some people, Jesus was very important prophet, not more than that. But interestingly, that Paul continually in his letters, he refers to Jesus as the image of God, as the one that was that came from God, and so on, and so that people will recognize that he is first. I think that's one of the challenges that we have in this brief hymn that we find here in Colossians. But secondly, I think the second focus of this passage, when we come to verse 21, Paul is now addressing you, that is, his audience, the Colossians, the Christians in Colossae, who are composed of mainly Gentiles, probably. And now he's talking about us. And you, who were once estranged and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death. So the first important thing here is you were once strange, hostile. He is probably referring clearly to the fact that the Gentiles weren't part of the Jewish family and the Jewish tradition and the part of the covenant with the Old Testament, people, the Israelites, and so on. So Paul is making a point that, well, you're not a second-class citizens. You were reconciled in Jesus, although you don't come from the Jewish family. You're not a descendant of Abraham. You once were estranged and hostile in mind, doing evil things. Well, this is the particular situation Paul is addressing, but of course this applies to all of us that were once away from the faith, but now we have been reconciled in his body of flesh by his death. It's interesting that the words you were estranged in the verse in 22, that you were reconciled, now been reconciled, strangely enough, These two words come from the same root word in Greek. By root word, I mean the basic word that from which derives many verbs and so on. And the root word is other, allos in Greek. And it's interesting how from this word comes the idea of being estranged and the idea of being reconciled. It gives one gives the idea of belonging to another, and the other of change and alter and transfer. What do we make of this? We were estranged from God's people. And now he has reconciled us. In other words, he changed your otherness. You're not other anymore. He changed our otherness to belonging to him. So that's the first thing he's speaking about his audience, which applies to all of us. We were once estranged, but we were reconciled in his body, in the body of his flesh, by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and reproachable before him. Again, it refers to Jesus' death. How can this person, who was the beginning of all creation, in him all things were created, dies? Well, he dies to reconcile us with God. So if he, let's say, verse 21 and 22 focuses in our status, our situation, or our new situation, verse 22 also will focus on a purpose for that. He uses the expression, so as to present yourselves, present you holy and blameless and irreproachable before him. So, again, the same as Jesus, there's a purpose. Now there's a purpose for us to have been reconciled with Jesus, so that we may live a holy and blameless life before him. That is, as long as, expression in verse 23, you could use this expression, verse 3, as long as, or provided that, you continue in faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which has been preached to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. We live times of so much antagonisms and divisions, and that we need to be able to understand the reality of this message, that in Jesus we are reconciled with God. In Jesus we are reconciled through his death, so that we may live a life, a holy life and blameless, and be able to go beyond our divisions and our separations. As I mentioned, Rowan Osman suggests that Judaism, contrary to Islam and Christianity, reflects a certain realism. It's true that the Bible shows the frailty of its heroes. It's true that it speaks of Jesus as not as a mere human, but as one who has the fullness of God. But at the same time, there's a realism in the sense that God himself came to our human need and reconciled all things in himself. And we are blessed to know that we are part of this plan of God, that we have been reconciled in Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you.